Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. Something a bit different this week. It'll just be me talking about Thanksgiving and how we think about the past. And I guess I could start by thinking about the recent past and what Thanksgiving looks like from the outside, with the possible exclusion of Canada. In my time in London, it was more prominent than I expected, and it's sort of an indication, I suppose, that quote-unquote American culture is very transatlantic, and it's certainly more prominent in the UK than it is here in the Upside Down, and I know a few Americans here as well. But I think there's sort of more to it. I think there's more of a shared identity thing going there. Because, for instance, it was interesting to see the growing popularity of 4th of July over my years in London, considering, what it commemorates. But it looks fascinating from the outside. It's the biggest travel weekend in the richest country on earth. So tens of millions of people move about the country. The numbers are, that large that, looking at it from the outside, it qualifies as, a biological migration event like African wildebeest or swallows returning to Europe. It's, in fact, it's that big that if you ceased commemorating Thanksgiving, you'd be very tempted to commemorate the commemorating instead. And in a way, we'll return to that idea. But first I want to think about and think with thanking. To thank, by definition, is to look back at a past event or events with gratitude. I mean, you can maybe sign off an email with thanks in advance, but in general, to be thankful is a backwards-looking move. And that post-meal ritual of looking back over the events of the past year in one's life and expressing thanks for the good and sometimes bad that have contributed to where your life is today is actually a very healthy psychological exercise we should do more often. But of course, it is inspired by an historic act of gratitude that is troubling on a number of levels, the least of which is, of course, historical accuracy. So you're probably all experiencing this now, or at least the American listeners. But Thanksgiving, as you likely learned it in school, represents a unidirectional view of the past. And we have such things here too. So Australia Day is now called Invasion Day, as a hashtag. And so it's potentially a bit closer to the Columbus Day issues because it commemorates the same thing, the quote-unquote discovery. But I actually view those challenges and troubles and debates that happen on the day as a good thing. It's like a ghost arriving at the table to be fed. And in many respects, it is literally a ghost, given the many hundreds of thousands of people who lost their lives as a result of it. And this is sort of what ghosts are for. They are there in a Dickensian sense to make you think about the past, make you look at it in a more honest way, to kind of rub your face in it. And in that sense, it's similar but different to, say, the Confederate statue situation, because it strikes me that it is equally wrong to, and not because both views are equal, but it is equally wrong to simply tear down the statues as it is to fight to keep them up. And when I did, and I'll explain that a bit more. So when I did genocide studies at university, one of the things we looked at was how Germany commemorates its World War II experiences. And it's not just, because they lost or whatever. It's because how do you think, when you are the quote-unquote bad guys, how do you commemorate stuff? How do you recall it? How do you think with the fact that your grandfather or great-grandfather may have been in the SS, but he believed he was fighting for his home. And you obviously can't do things like throw up statues of Hitler or little replica gas chambers. And so Germany's had a number of decades of thinking with this idea. They're sort of further ahead than America and certainly Australia in what do you do? How do you separate remembrance from approval? And if you look at some of the commemorative spaces across Germany, they're good. There's a lot of thought that's gone into this idea. And I recalled these studies every time I went to Hamburg when I was working for a German startup, because I'd go there every second week. And Hamburg's an interesting case because being a port, it was bombed into oblivion. So there's not actually that much original Hamburg left. So there's sort of a double challenge when it comes to commemoration. And some local artist, I was told about it on my second or third trip, he'd looked up old maps of what the city looked like prior to World War II and obviously prior to the bombing. And he'd gone around and painted gold on a single cobblestone outside of every house where Jews were deported from. And it's a perfect commemoration in its own way. It's really arresting, particularly, you're walking home after work and it's getting dark, and so it sort of twinkles. But it's really arresting because it surprises you with remembrance in a way bold statues can't. You sort of, turn the corner into a massive plaza and there's a big statue. It's very different. But it also reminds you that you've almost forgotten, because you aren't thinking about the Holocaust as you were walking back to your hotel room or house or apartment or whatever. You just aren't. And then you'll get this twinkle, and it'll be a twinkle at the front of a bicycle shop or, a cafe or something, or a modern block of apartments. And there are these layers of unbidden but essential remembering. And it also, it reminds you of the event, which is horrifying, but it also reminds you of how little of it remains and how easy it is that it can slip from not even top of mind, but slip in a way it shouldn't from the story of a place. And so, if you live somewhere where the Civil War is called the War of Northern Aggression, for instance, regardless of your feelings about the Civil War, the experience is a defining one for civic life and identity, and public spaces are still the best places to think with those ideas on an ongoing basis. And crucially, I think they're spaces that allow us to have our thinking with evolve. And so, very obviously, slave-owning generals no longer represent the best way into publicly acknowledging defining moments in a state or a city's past. But you don't just then erase it. You can't erase the past and go, done, nobody's racist now. You work out instead by sitting with what does best represent it today and commemorate that. And that was kind of what Germany worked through. And obviously it's ongoing, but it's what they had to do it potentially more urgently. The times were different. But that's really the only way you can do it. And if that process was somehow up to me, which obviously it's not, but I would gather up all those inappropriate statues, and they are inappropriate in the 21st century. And I'd gather them up because they are themselves historical artifacts now, because they represent changing and improving views on race and justice and so on by the very act of their removal, but also by the longevity in which they were in these public places. And I would display them, I guess, in some sort of garden of old ideas, where they can be left to be unmaintained, where they can be left to crumble and be reclaimed by vines and the elements and so on. And that is partially inspired by how Nuremberg has treated Zeppenfield. So it's been, if you've seen any of Leni Riefenstahl's films or whatever, where the Nuremberg rallies happen, that big field has been left to crumble over time. And there's ongoing debate about whether it should be maintained. And the majority idea is that no, it should be left to ruination. Because ruination is the perfect commemoration of change over time. And so when you look at, and it strikes me as a binary thing. I don't want to say, please don't misinterpret this as saying, oh, well, both sides have some good points. It's not that. It's, you don't dissolve the overlap between Confederate hagiography and remembering the past by unilaterally banning statues, because the hagiography just goes underground and pops up again, just to pull an idea out of my head, with crowds wielding Walmart torches in front of improbably convenient cameras. Space has to be allocated because it's a thing that's happening. So it is part of the public interaction. Space has to be allocated to allow, I guess, contemplation among Confederate hagiographers that the things they like, the few things they like about their heroes, come with a lot of things that they should not like. And that kind of garden of old ideas is, I'm not saying it's a solve, but it's an example of how they also don't have the tools of thinking with ideas, and they view erasure as an erasure of the entire past, rather than the emanation of and a pivot and kind of a change. The thing is, that change is still inclusive, but the sort of unilateral erasures on both sides makes it a flashpoint instead. And this is really what Ruin's for. And also, erasure is also an injustice to the intervening generations of Black Americans, say, between the end of slavery and today, with their kids with hearts in the right place, knocking down statues and so on. Because those intervening generations lived their entire lives in public spaces dominated by these statues. So it's immature, however sincere, and noble the goals and so on, to think that can be swept aside, like done. And I use the word immature deliberately, because contact with history grows you up. And I got that idea. I'm going to read a little bit from a book now. I don't know if you guys watch One Mississippi. If you don't, you should. But I'm having flashbacks to the main character in that. But I got this idea from John Lewis Gaddis, who is a professor of military and naval history at Yale. So when you're kind of talking about how you commemorate things and violence and what even the point of history, there's a lot to be said for this. So I'm just going to read a paragraph from it. If that's what maturity means in human relationships, the arrival at identity by way of insignificance, then I would define historical consciousness as the projection of that maturity through time. We understand how much has preceded us and how unimportant we are in relation to it. We learn our place and we come to realize that it isn't a large one. Even a superficial acquaintance with the existence through millennia of time of numberless human beings, the historian Geoffrey Elton has pointed out, helps to correct the normal adolescent inclination to relate the world to oneself instead of relating oneself to the world. History teaches those adjustments and insights which help the adolescent to become adult, surely a worthy service in the education of youth. So then he quotes Mark Twain, who said something similar. Well, I'm not going to read the Mark Twain quotation because I'd be too tempted to do it with the accent, and you do not want that, especially if you've just eaten a large meal. But Mark Twain uses the analogy of saying, we'll say all of history is the Eiffel Tower. That it took 100 million years to prepare the world for man, and that's we're at the top. And at the very, very pinnacle, the skin of the paint on the absolute top of it represents man's share of the entire age of, say, the Earth. And and he says, and anybody would perceive that the skin was what the tower was built for, and that's him being, clever. It's not even deep geological time, but it's thinking about how we think with history and longer timelines and so on. And it's that kind of, it is immature to think that the Eiffel Tower is somehow defined and built for that tiny, thin layer of paint at its very top, when the rest of it represents all of previous history. And that's kind of it's sort of a foundational idea to begin this process of thinking with. And given that it is Thanksgiving, I am thankful that our views on the past are changing. They are, and that's all very good. This is, I wrote a history book, a history nerd. But I'm also thankful that we don't have to kind of like completely work this out this instant on Twitter. And that's the kind of disappointing low-resolution paradox in acknowledging that the world has changed over the last 120 years. And that we need to now be thinking differently about and with the past. Because the paradox is we want it done instantly. But that's not how ruination works. And it's just not how these processes work. It's sort of an artifact of modern commercial thinking, right? And just thinking back on the near recent past, the night before the event that Connor and I did in LA, we were joking that we should have named the event Hills to Die On, because, and this is where it relates to history, like here we are living on the wrong side of, the intersectional singularity, where what was a useful internal method of personal mapping and interrogation has now been turned, instead of internal, it's been turned outward to be used as some sort of globe-spanning, fully explanatory epistemology, and it just isn't, and it's a mess, and it's an example of some really good and important and timely ideas that are being built on some probably false foundational assumptions, and these are then rigorously defended. And these are the proverbial hills to die on. And it's done so in a way that puts all the goals at risk. So to have that kind of binary attitude to destroying statues, it's putting the goals at risk, because leaving them up is wrong. But that it doesn't necessarily follow that your instant reactionary, Instagrammable response is correct. And it is at such a risk that the goal that you are after will be hindered rather than helped by it. And it's sort of... So what Pete Carroll said about magic, and I use this a lot, but it's because it's useful. He says that it works in practice, but not in theory. This applies equally to, a noble quest for justice and equality. It works in practice. The practice is the thing you pivot towards. The theory has a lot of risks. And it has a lot of risks because the foundational assumptions are still built in that sort of naive empirical materialism. And so, I'm thankful once again, Thanksgiving, that this quest is the mood of our time. I am concerned about some of the hills because I want to win. And I'm concerned that the epistemology we summon to think with the past considers erasure a viable option. And it's not a viable option to anything. And wanting it erased, again, it's the practice but not theory, is entirely understandable from the position, from a justice position, it's entirely understandable, but it's a hill to die on to think that erasure will work. And I guess part of this, and the premium members will be familiar with it, you can't go back. It's a foundational error of naive empiricism. So you can't treat history, and we do, as we treat so much if we don't examine our presuppositions. We have a materialist naturalism and an atomized universe baked in. But so Dr. Tim Ingold, which you'll be familiar with if you're a premium member, prefers, when it comes to exploring animism, for instance, an epistemology of lines rather than separate blobs or objects in materialist naturalism that we more typically unthinkingly think with. And part of that, and part of the lines model, is that you can't go back. Whatever comes next, by definition, has to emerge continuously from the now. So even if what comes next is an attempted reconstitution of the past, and, this remains a serious blind spot in contemporary neo-paganism, it still emerges from now in a connected line. There's no jumping back and fixing it. That's a really machine universe materialist era. And bringing that back then to Thanksgiving or Australia Day, you can't, and particularly Thanksgiving, because it has a wider, in the same way a lot of the other civic festivals don't. And I guess the reason why I think of it as Australia Day, for people who are unfamiliar, whilst it is effectively our Columbus Day, it's also effectively Thanksgiving on a behavioral basis, because this is the day, obviously it's in late January here, so it's high summer. This is a day for family and friends and a ritualized identical meal every year and same behaviors and so on. So whilst it is Columbus Day, it's in the same thinking with category as Thanksgiving. And there is talk every year of banning it or moving it, just, as there is for, and Columbus Day, there's a case to be made for it. Maybe it's a topic for a different show, but you can't ban Thanksgiving because the ban emerges from the continuous celebration of Thanksgiving and kind of turning around and looking at that idea. And if you ban it, you can't. It's better considered, what you're actually asking for is a considered celebration through absence, because its problems and its wrong-headedness remain, and potentially even ossify. And this is where I see it as a kind of kissing cousin notion to the Confederate statue situation, because it sounds good. It's, woke to ban it. But do you want to win or not? Because banning it just ossifies it, and moves it into a space where it can do that. It can metastasize. Instead, and this, I think, I sometimes despair for my country and sometimes don't. I despair. The media here is the worst in the developed world, and I don't mean from a fake news perspective. You Americans definitely have that. I just mean from a talent and competency perspective. And so it's not very good at running discussion. But with something like Thanksgiving or Australia Day, what I would suggest is celebrating it by finding its new edges. The anniversary of a wrong way of commemorating Indigenous experience is absolutely the right time to think about those experiences and have those discussions with, family members who don't think of them at all. Because, again, statue relevant, outdated modes of thinking are impervious to hectoring. And the more you try to do it, the more intransigent the outdated thinker becomes. So you have to ask yourself whether you want to win, or whether you want to have, the loudest correct opinion at the table. And unfortunately, for most people, it is the latter. And I think if they have these discussions or these thoughts, the kind of thing we're talking about on the podcast, they'll realize, I don't actually want to have the loudest correct opinion. I do, in fact, want to win. It just hadn't occurred to me that there is a hill that I don't need to die on in how we do this. Because we win in the end. This is coming through this story of the challenges of how we think with history and why we should think with history. Why if you are the people, I'm one of them. I don't call it Invasion Day, but I'm absolutely 100% aligned with, calling out the problems with something like Australia Day. The way out is through. And it may, in the course of subsequent generations, Australia Day, Thanksgiving, whatever, look different. It may even have a name change. I just don't think banning it, or in the case of Australia Day, moving it, is aligned with the line, because you're still faced with the challenge of commemorating previous commemorations, which is an important part of the journey towards a new thinking with history and society and so on. Because, as I said, we win in the end. And I mean all of it. Racial equality, gender equality, trans rights, everything. And I think people who listen to the show feel that. It's, unlikely any of us will be alive to unfurl the proverbial mission accomplished banner. But, the magically operant should have no problems thinking with such and around such puny human understandings of time. It's irrelevant if you're here for it or not. And we win not by unilateral declarations of wokeness, but by, riding the line, by lining with this thread like another Ingold motif, like voices in a choir. And I guess, in the end, that, above all, is what I'm thankful for. All your voices in the choir. All our lovely little lines. So, happy Thanksgiving.